My name is Sammy Myers, and today I will be diving into the concepts of the post-impressionism movement and its lasting effect on the future of art. First, what is post-impressionism? What's impressionism itself? Post-impressionism was the following art era right after impressionism. It took form right at the turn of the 20th century, and unlike impressionism that took a realistic perspective and presented scenes as they were experienced, Post-impressionism strayed away from that naturalistic approach and aimed for rather exaggerated features. Characteristics of post-impressionism art were vibrant colors and distinct lines that would take more importance in the painting than realistic shading and detail. This was to distance itself from previous impressionist artwork. Impressionists painted as they viewed it, and post-impressionists painted as they want the viewers to view it. Think of Impressionism as a vague illustration description of a scene, meanwhile Post-Impressionism is the overly exaggerated version. There were many Post-Impressionist artists that emerged from the dying Impressionism movement, but one of the most influential figures would be Paul Cézanne. Cézanne was a French Post-Impressionist artist who would explore the very early stages of what would soon become Cubism and eventually Surrealism. Cézanne was known for using large strokes and thick daubs of color, often using a palette knife to apply the paint. He would reduce objects to basic geometric forms and create simplistic shapes laid out flat on the canvas. Thick strokes would add dimension without shading to real-life objects. The paint texture would help juxtapose color gradation. Cézanne was also known for reviving still life paintings and still incorporating post-impressionist techniques. These techniques didn't allow him to refine details or specific colors, which would soon become the basis for the Cubist movement out of post-impressionist art. This style is seen best in one of his early post-impressionist piece, the Bibémus Quarry. In this painting, Cézanne utilizes jagged, thick and thin broken lines to outline the shapes of the angular sculpted rocks. The color he uses is a consistent palette, not showing much differences in value, but visible texture from brushstrokes are present. The still life being depicted is of a sandstone plateau, decorated with pine trees. The Bibémus quarries are abandoned and overgrown quarries in the Aix-en-Provence, France, where Cézanne lived. He would often inspect and mine these quarries for inspiration for his artwork. Cézanne aimed for visually appealing art, rather than realism into his artwork. He would avoid looking into light aspects and kept changing visuals around him to make what he was painting more interesting. He painted how he felt about the world and not how it truly was. Some traits, such as the jagged geometric shapes along the quarry, would exponentially move towards influencing Cubism and Cubist artists alike. Now, Cubism. Cubist artists. What are those, you ask? Cubism is seen as the most avant-garde art movement up until the pop art movement in the 1950s and 60s. Cubism tends to focus on multiple perspectives of the same object. Inspired by the work of Paul Cézanne, Cubists aimed to avoid three-dimensional traits that were the norm since the Renaissance or even medieval artwork. The term cubist/cubism came from a derogatory remark made by an art critic, and the term became widespread to describe this art style and eventual movement. Cubist art had mostly simplified natural shapes into geometric shapes, including cubes, squares, triangles, and spheres. This is most exemplified in Jean Metzinger's Le Goûter, which means tea time in English. Metzinger was also a French artist who would create a bountiful collection of post-impressionist art, including a variety of Cubist pieces. This one in particular is the most critically acclaimed of his, and it's sometimes even called the Mona Lisa of Cubism. At first glance, it may look a bit jumbled, but each shape represents a different perspective of the object or person it's depicting. Metzinger uses geometric lines to cut off the object's true shape and includes value variance to reinforce its multi-perspective view. The color value also combines the style of classicism with its controversial modernity touch. If it is still unclear as to what is truly being depicted here, it's of a woman seated at a table holding a spoon, drinking her tea, with a red vase behind her. Cubism reached its peak between 1907 and 1914, mainly due to the rise of photography making realistic paintings seem less appealing, not only to viewers but to artists creating them. Cubism is considered the most radical and influential art movement of the 20th century because it moved further and further away from traditional ideas of representational art, such as Impressionism or even early Post-Impressionism. Cubism's characteristics would soon evolve and lead to abstraction and Surrealism. Surrealism is another subconcept of the Post-Impressionist art movement. Inspired by Cubism's distinct way of representation, Surrealism takes it even further. There is a pattern, if you haven't noticed, and it's that the post-impressionism movement is more about moving away from tradition and realism and striving for something beyond. Surrealism first began during the 1910s, either after the debut of Cubism or perhaps even simultaneously. Surrealism, though, is one that is quite hard to truly explain due to its revolutionary take as an art style, but it can be described as ambitious, contradictory, and complex. Surrealism oftentimes revolves around an artist's dream and the self-conscious human mind truly digging deep into imagination. Surrealist artists would outsource creative control to each other and go to extreme ranges to create something either visually appealing, appalling, or just downright discomforting. Their goal was to evoke emotion or question. A major post-impressionist figure that would practice the Cubist technique of multiple perspectives, but also include qualities of surrealism, is none other than Pablo Picasso. Picasso produced an influx of pieces that can be described as Cubism or Surrealism, and one of the most well-known artworks that fall under the Surrealism category is the portrait of Dora Maar. Dora Maar herself was a Surrealist artist-photographer. She would often frequent Surrealist circles in places like Le Deux Magots Café, where she would meet Picasso in 1935. A year later after meeting, she became his love interest and artistic muse. Muse is a person or personified force that is the source of inspiration for an artist, and this is proven by the multiple portraits of Dora Maar produced by Picasso. As evident in this piece, Picasso enjoyed playing with different perspectives of the human face and using colors that wouldn't naturally be present in real life. The features of objects like clothing are created with jagged lines, meanwhile features of the face, such as the outline of Dora Maar's nose and jaw, is softened with curves. She's given flesh tones of yellow and green along the rosy apple on her cheek, which could either be from her blushing while her portrait was being taken by Picasso, or perhaps she was holding an apple, and Picasso illustrated it as so, to add a more surrealist flair, combining object and person. Dora's eyes are looking in different directions. The nostrils of her nose are both visible despite having a side profile bridge of her nose being depicted. In this piece and many of Picasso's other works, you can see the influence of post-impressionist line work from Paul Cézanne and even abandonment of single-view perspectives from Cubist artists from the 1910s. So that's what makes up the post-impressionism movement, and its concepts like Cubism and Surrealism, which would go on to inspire future artists and artworks. And this here is my recreation of Picasso's Dora Maar portrait. Thank you so much for watching.